We're just going to cover what we believe to be some of the most important topics that they discussed. And we're going to play several clips because honestly, I think some of Putin's responses were actually pretty eye-opening.
That this definitely confirms my theory that the US is part of this group of global elitists. I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjekovic. And we are unapologetically outspoken. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this special episode of the podcast. So normally we do our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes, but because of Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin, we wanted to put out a special episode. And before we get into the details of the interview, Stephanie, I have to say, as soon as I woke up this morning, I started to look for news articles. And we were talking about this when Tucker announced that he was going to interview Putin. And pretty much every article was talking about how Tucker had no credibility among, quote, real journalists. An article in the Washington Examiner pointed out that he's been slandered for, quote, promoting conspiracies, being pro-Kremlin, flirting with right-wing grifters, and spreading racially tinged disinformation, end quote. And then the Washington Post reported, quote, the Kremlin's decision to allow the interview demonstrated Putin's interest in building bridges to the disruptive MAGA element of the Republican Party, end quote. And then the National Interest reported that Russia launched one of its largest missile attacks on Ukraine while Tucker was, quote, gallivanting around Moscow, end quote. So the author described Tucker as a propagandist, a genocidaire, which that's a term I haven't heard before, and a warmonger. And he wrote, quote, to expect Tucker to be an honest journalist is like expecting Putin to be a liberal Democrat. Putin knows that Tucker is his stooge, end quote. But clearly, a lot of America is in support of Tucker because when he was kicked off Fox and he started his own show, the Tucker Carlson Network, since then, his episodes have consistently gotten millions more viewership than the MSM, and I'm sure this episode with Putin will be no exception. Remember his first episode, the interview with Trump during the GOP debates? That got over 267 million views. So one of the other things the Washington Examiner article said was, quote, Carlson succeeds where the legacy media does not because he is not a routine liar and everyone knows it. Public trust in the media is at a record low of 32% according to Axios, end quote. And so apparently Russia agrees because a spokesperson for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, told reporters that it denied requests from other Western outlets for an interview, but it granted an interview to Tucker because, quote, his position is different from Anglo-Saxon media. It's not pro-Russian, it's not pro-Ukrainian, it's pro-American, end quote. And as someone who is definitely pro-American, I'm interested in this conversation. Aren't you, Stephanie?
Oh, yeah, I couldn't wait for it. And it's first of all, with them saying that Tucker is a warmonger, he's the exact opposite. He's been denouncing every war that Biden has gotten us into. So they don't even know what they're talking about, but they're panicking. They're panicking because they know their narrative is going to fall apart when we find out who the real warmongers are. And they're panicking because their whole house of cards is falling apart. People aren't tuning in to the mainstream news anymore. They're tuning in to people like Tucker, who are real journalists talking directly to the person we should be talking to instead of just all this hearsay.
Exactly. And this interview that he did with Putin is incredibly long. I think it was over 2 hours. And so we're just going to cover what we believe to be some of the most important topics that they discussed. And we're going to play several clips because honestly, I think some of Putin's responses were actually pretty eye-opening. So the first 30 minutes of the interview is a very long, drawn-out history of Russia. But the one thing I did get from that I want to point out is Putin was talking about NATO. And how back in 1991, this was long after the Cold War was over, Russia was expecting to be welcomed into NATO, but it didn't happen. And he talked about how he believes this is because Russia's too big of a country and they're outspoken with their own opinions. And he mentioned that, the United States had promised that NATO would not expand eastward towards Russia. But then it happened not once, not twice, but 5 times. And each time Russia tolerated it. And they kept trying to persuade the US that there was no communist party in power in Russia at that point. They had a market economy and they wanted to negotiate. But then the Serbia conflict started. And, Russia stood up for Serbia in that conflict. And when the US bombed Belgrade, they saw it as a violation of the UN Charter. And Putin said that that was when the US, quote, let the genie out of the bottle, end quote. So he was basically claiming that Russia has tried to build relationships with the United States on multiple occasions. He referred to the war in Iraq and how Putin said he used a prudent approach to tell the US not to support separatism and terrorism, but we went ahead and did it anyway. And one of the comments he made was, quote, the US leadership exerts pressure and all NATO obediently vote, even if they don't like something, end quote.
It's
So
true.
exactly. And so about halfway through the interview, geez, I can't talk today as usual. Putin started relating all of the history that he spent, 40 minutes talking about to the current situation in Ukraine by saying that in 2008, the doors were opened for Ukraine to join NATO, and Russia was not in agreement with it. And then in 2014, there was the coup in Ukraine, which was started by Zelensky's predecessor, and they started persecuting the people who didn't agree with the coup. And Russia saw this as a threat to Crimea, and so they took Crimea under protection. And in Putin's mind, he said this is when the conflict with Ukraine actually started. And then he commented that Russia did not start the war in 2014 and they didn't start the war in 2022 and that they were merely attempting to stop it.
Right. And so at that point, Tucker asked Putin if he stopped it yet. And Putin said no, because there is still Nazification and there should be a prohibition of all kinds of neo-Nazi movements. Now, this got my attention because I don't know about you, Tara, but I never hear anyone talking about this. Like, I had no idea.
This I have because I've heard, I don't know if it was on Real AF or something, because Andy always talks about, things going on that most people aren't talking about. But it was, oh my God, I just realized my microphone isn't plugged in. Can you
Oh,
even hear me?
yeah, I can hear you fine.
Really? How weird.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess my computer's recording me and not the mic. Um, yeah, I've heard before that Ukraine is like has a very, or Zelensky has a
Mhm.
very neo-Nazi perspective.
Well, I mean, I have not heard that before, but it would make sense that the media wouldn't report on that because they don't want to be seen as supporting neo-Nazis, you know? And so he explains the history of it and just pretty much talks about how when Ukraine gained its independence, it started building its identity on, quote, false heroes who collaborated with Hitler, people who exterminated Poles, Jews, and Russians. It is necessary to stop this practice and prevent the dissemination of this concept, end quote. So he went on to say that he looks at Ukrainians as though they are Russian people, but that if they want to be separate, that's fine, but not on the basis of Nazi ideology. And he said they look at Nazis as national heroes and even have statues of them. And this goes all the way up to government officials, which again, I had no idea that this was happening in Ukraine. And so Tucker asked him, well, how do you plan to stop this in a country where you don't have control? And Putin responded that they actually had come to an agreement in Istanbul. And part of the agreement was that Nazism, or I don't even know if I'm saying that right, would not be cultivated in Ukraine and it would be prohibited at the legislative level. So when they went to sign the agreement in Kiev, they had talked before and the Ukrainians said, you need to pull your Russian troops out of Kiev for the signing. And so Putin agreed and removed his troops. And as soon as he did, the Ukrainian officials threw out the agreement. And so that brings us to the situation now that's unfolding. And he also said that Zelensky legislated a ban on negotiating with Russia. So at this point, how are they supposed to negotiate and end this war if it's forbidden to negotiate? So then this conversation takes place with Tucker about Putin's communication with Biden, which is very interesting. So take a listen to this.
Have a dialogue. Is that not right? Well, but you wouldn't be speaking to the Ukrainian president, you'd be speaking to the American president. When was the last time you spoke to Joe Biden? I cannot remember when I talked to him. I do not remember. We can look it up. You don't remember? No. Why? I have to remember everything. I have my own things to do. We have domestic political affairs. Well, he's funding the war that you're fighting, so I would think that would be memorable. Well, yes, he funds, but I talked to him before the special military operation, of course. And I said to him then, by the way, I will not go into details, I never do. But I said to him then, I believe that you are making a huge mistake of historic proportions by supporting everything that is happening there in Ukraine by pushing Russia away. I told him repeatedly, by the way. I think that would be correct if I stop here. What did he say? Ask him, please. It is easier for you. You are a citizen of the United States. Go and ask him. It is not appropriate for me to comment on our conversation. But you haven't spoken to him since before February of 2022. No, we haven't spoken. Certain contacts are being maintained, though. Speaking of which, do you remember what I told you about my proposal to work together on a missile defense system? Yes. You can ask all of them. All of them are safe and sound, thank God. The former president, Condoleezza, is safe and sound, and I think Mr. Gates and the current director of the intelligence agency, Mr. Burns, the then ambassador to Russia, in my opinion, are very successful ambassador. They were all witnesses to these conversations.
Okay, so I think that there's a lot going on with what he said, and you have to read between the lines a little bit. But when he says, like, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to say about speaking to Biden, it just had me thinking, because then he brings up like 5 different people in the Biden administration that he's been in talks with, and he's saying, thank God they're safe. And he's saying he hasn't actually spoken to Biden since before the war and like wouldn't clarify. So what that led me to believe is that he's kind of saying without saying that Biden's not really in charge or capable of communication at this point, and it's his administration that's really running the country. And that's why he wouldn't go into details, because like that, I mean, imagine the massive problem that would come from that if another world leader called this out on an interview. So like that to me though was like a red flag that like, yep, Biden's not in control, and he's pretty much telling us that without saying it. Is that what you got from it?
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting when he brought up Bill Gates.
Yeah. When he said that, I was like, Gates, is he talking about Bill Gates? Like, or is
Maybe
this
it
someone
wasn't.
else?
Okay, maybe it wasn't Bill
Well, I
Gates, and
thought the same thing though, because I'm like, what other Gates would it be? You know?
I don't know.
So yeah. But if he brought like if he did, he's saying Condoleezza Rice, Gates. Well, Bill Gates, in my eyes, is part of the global elitists. So maybe he was hinting at that like those are the people that he's really talking to. And it doesn't matter. Biden doesn't matter. He's talking to like the globalists. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. And then Tucker did ask him, why doesn't he just call Biden to work things out so that it doesn't escalate to World War III? And Putin's response was that Russia has been conveying to U.S. leadership, quote, if you really want to stop fighting, you need to stop supplying weapons. It'll be over within a few weeks. That's it. And then we can agree on some terms. Before you do that, stop. Why would I call him? What should I talk to him about? End quote. And I think that's fair. Like, I think he's made that very clear. And, you know, the US doesn't want to play ball.
Yeah. And so this next clip is a long one, but it was the conversation that occurred right after that. And Tucker is asking Putin if he thinks NATO's worried about the escalation of this conflict, he asked him about like Putin's views on America's involvement in the war and who Putin thinks attacked the Nord Stream pipeline. And I think Putin's answers are pretty powerful. So this is a long clip, but it's definitely worth listening to.
NATO is worried about this becoming a global war or a nuclear conflict? At least that's what they're talking about. And they're trying to intimidate their own population with an imaginary Russian threat. This is an obvious fact. And thinking people, not Philistines, but thinking people, analysts, those who are engaged in real politics, just smart people understand perfectly well that this is a fake. They're trying to fuel the Russian threat. The threat I think you're referring to is a Russian invasion of Poland, Latvia, expansionist behavior. Can you imagine a scenario where you sent Russian troops to Poland? Only in one case, if Poland attacks Russia. Why? Because we have no interest in Poland, Latvia, or anywhere else. Why would we do that? We simply don't have any interest. It's just threat mongering. Well, the argument, I know you know this, is that, well, he invaded Ukraine. He has territorial aims across the continent, and you're saying unequivocally you don't. Это абсолютно исключено. It is absolutely out of the question. You just don't have to be any kind of analyst. It goes against common sense to get involved in some kind of a global war. And a global war will bring all humanity to the brink of destruction. It's obvious. There are certainly means of deterrence. They have been scaring everyone with us all along. Tomorrow, Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons. Tomorrow, Russia will use that. No, the day after tomorrow. So what? In order to extort additional money from US taxpayers and European taxpayers in the confrontation with Russia in the Ukrainian theater of war. The goal is to weaken Russia as much as possible. One of our senior United States senators from the state of New York, Chuck Schumer, said yesterday, I believe, that we have to continue to fund the Ukrainian effort or US soldiers, citizens could wind up fighting there. How do you assess that? This is a provocation, and a cheap provocation at that. I do not understand why American soldiers should fight in Ukraine. There are mercenaries from the United States there. The bigger number of mercenaries comes from Poland, with mercenaries from the United States in second place and mercenaries from Georgia in third place. Well, if somebody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly bring humanity to the brink of very serious global conflict. This is obvious. Do the United States need this? What for? Thousands of miles away from your national territory. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt, more than $33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine? Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia, make an agreement, already understanding the situation that is developing today, realizing that Russia will fight for its interests to the end? And realizing this, actually return to common sense, start respecting our country and its interests, and look for certain solutions. It seems to me that this is much smarter and more rational. Who blew up Nord Stream? You for sure. I was busy that day. Nate, I did not blow up Nord Stream. Thank you, though.
У вас лично, может быть, есть алиби, у вас лично.
You personally may have an alibi, but the CIA has no such alibi. Did you have evidence that NATO or the CIA did it?
Вы знаете,
You know, I won't get into details, but people always say in such cases, look for someone who is interested. But in this case, we should not only look for someone who is interested, but also for someone who has capabilities. Because there may be many people interested, but not all of them are capable of sinking to the bottom of the Baltic Sea and carrying out this explosion. These two components should be connected. Who is interested and who is capable of doing it?
But I'm confused. I mean, that's the biggest act of industrial terrorism ever. And it's the largest emission of CO2 in history. Okay, so if you had evidence, and presumably given your security services, your intel services, you would, that NATO, the US, CIA, the West did this, why wouldn't you present it and win a propaganda victory?
в войне пропаганды очень сложно.
In the war of propaganda, it is very difficult to defeat the United States because the United States controls all the world's media and many European media. The ultimate beneficiary of the biggest European media are American financial institutions. Don't you know that? So it is possible to get involved in this work, but it is cost prohibitive, so to speak. We can simply shine the spotlight on our sources of information, and we will not achieve results. It is clear to the whole world what happened, and even American analysts talk about it directly. It's true.
Okay, that was a long clip, but didn't you think he had some very interesting things to say there?
Well, yeah, because the whole reason that we're in Ukraine and the whole reason that they think we need to keep sending money, just like what the comment he made about Chuck Schumer, is that if we don't, then Russia is going to go beyond Ukraine and come into Europe, and then it's World War III and they're going to nuke us. And I mean, he's flat out saying that would not happen. And there is no scenario in which he's going to go into Poland unless Poland were to like invade Russia. So he's flat out saying like the nuclear threat is that's all it is. Like it's just a threat. It's fear mongering. He doesn't want any of that. He doesn't want to get into a world war. So they're using all this fear to try and get support for why they're spending billions of dollars in Ukraine. And it's all just a made up thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I got from it too. And quite honestly, like I thought it was his response though about the Nord Stream pipeline was interesting. Basically saying that, you know, because the US controls the media worldwide, like what's the
Right.
point?
Exactly. And we all know like what happened with that. And so I think he's kind of saying like it's obvious, you
Yeah.
know, and like, yeah, so very interesting.
Yeah, and he also had some very interesting things to say about China. And in the beginning of the interview, Putin made a very random statement. They weren't even talking about China at the time, but he said, quote, "The West is afraid of a strong China more than it fears a strong Russia. Because Russia has 150 million people and China has 1.5 billion, and its economy is growing by leaps and bounds at 5% a year. It used to be even more. China's potential is enormous. It's the biggest economy in the world today in terms of purchasing power parity and the size of the economy. It has already taken over the United States a long time ago, and it's growing at a rapid clip. Let's not talk about who is afraid of whom," end quote. So then later in the interview, he's talking about how America basically uses the US dollar as their main weapon to preserve power throughout the world. And Putin said that this is stupid and it's a grave mistake. So I want to play the clip of what he had to say about that.
Look at what is going on in the world. Even the United States allies are now downsizing their dollar reserves. Seeing this, everyone starts looking for ways to protect themselves. But the fact that the United States applies restrictive measures to certain countries, such as placing restrictions on transactions, freezing assets, etc., causes great concern and sends a signal to the whole world. What did we have here? Until 2022, about 80% of Russian foreign trade transactions were made in US dollars and euros. US dollars accounted for approximately 50% of our transactions with third countries, Well, currently it is down to 13%. It wasn't us who banned the use of the US dollar.
США приняли решение ограничить наши расчеты в долларах.
We had no such intention. It was decision of the United States to restrict our transactions in US dollars. I think it is complete foolishness from the point of view of the interests of the United States itself and its taxpayers, as it damages the US economy, undermines the power of the United States across the world. By the way, our transactions in yuan accounted for about 3%.
Сейчас 34%.
Today, 34% of our transactions are made in rubles and about as much, a little over 34% in yuan.
Зачем Соединенные Штаты это сделали?
Why did the United States do this? My only guess is self-conceit. They probably thought it would lead to full collapse, but nothing collapsed. Moreover, other countries, including oil producers, are thinking of and already accepting payments for oil in yuan. Do you even realize what is going on or not?
Вы понимаете, что это такое происходит?
Does anyone in the United States realize this?
Тех же Соединенных Штатов.
What are you doing? You're cutting yourself off. All experts say this.
То, что всегда...
Ask any intelligent and thinking person in the United States what the dollar means for the US.
Что такое доллар?
You're killing it with your own hands.
I think that
He has a point there.
Such a good point. Yeah, we've talked about the US dollar collapsing and we're to blame for that. I mean, these sanctions has basically propped up China and Russia, and now they're all working together against us. And like, we're screwed at this point. I mean, do you think they're going to go back to using the dollar when they're using 34% of the Chinese yuan and the ruble? Like, no, we've totally
Exactly.
screwed ourselves.
Yeah. And he also made some very interesting comments when Tucker asked him if he thinks that relations would be different if we had someone else, aka someone other than Biden, leading the United States. And Putin responded by saying that he had good relationships with Bush and with Trump because it's not about the leader's personality, it's about the elite mindset. And he said, quote, "If the idea of domination at any cost based on forceful actions dominates the American society, nothing will change," end quote. And I thought it was very interesting that throughout the interview, Putin never referred to Biden by name. And he only referred to Zelensky by name once at the very end of the interview, but he freely used other names. He referred to the Biden admin as Washington, but never actually said Biden. But yet he brought up Xi Jinping, he brought up Bush, Trump, and even Elon Musk. And so I think that says a lot.
Oh, yeah. Again, like I think he's hinting at the fact that Biden is not the one that's in control. I mean, he made it pretty crystal clear. And yeah, that's so concerning because if he's not in control, then who's the one that's getting us into all these wars and destroying the dollar? You know, like I think that's totally what he was hinting to. And then towards the end of the interview, Tucker asked Putin if he'd be willing to release the Wall Street Journal reporter who's been imprisoned in Russia for the past year as a sign of decency. And Putin gave another interesting response. So he said, quote, "We've done so many gestures of goodwill out of decency that I think we've run out of them. We have never seen anyone reciprocate to us in a similar manner. However, in theory, we can say we do not rule that out. We can do that if our partners take reciprocal steps," end quote. And so Tucker tried to argue that the reporter's not a spy and he's basically just a young kid. But Putin said that he was caught red-handed with confidential information, and that boils down to espionage. Then he said he sincerely wants the reporter to return to the U.S., and it's not really benefiting Russia to keep him in prison, but he wants the U.S. Special Services to consider how to collectively achieve goals with Russia. And Tucker's final questions were about ending the war in Ukraine by communicating, again, directly with Biden. And so let's listen to what Putin had to say to that.
How motivated are you just to call the US government and say, let's come to terms?
Послушайте, я уже сказал.
I already said that we did not refuse to talk. We're willing to negotiate. It is the Western side, and Ukraine is obviously a satellite state of the US. It is evident. I do not want you to take it as if I'm looking for a strong word or an insult, but we both understand what is happening. The financial support, 72 billion US dollars, was provided. Germany ranks second, then other European countries come. Dozens of billions of US dollars are going to Ukraine. There's a huge influx of weapons. In this case, you should tell the current Ukrainian leadership to stop and come to negotiating table, rescind this absurd decree. We did not refuse.
Sure, but you already said it. I didn't think you meant it as an insult because you already said correctly. It's been reported that Ukraine was prevented from negotiating a peace settlement by the former British Prime Minister acting on behalf of the Biden administration. So, of course, they're a satellite. Big countries control small countries. That's not new. And that's why I asked about dealing directly with the Biden administration, which is making these decisions, not President Zelensky of Ukraine.
Если администрация Зеленского на Украине отказалась от переговоров, я исхожу
Well,
из того, что
if the Zelensky administration in Ukraine refused to negotiate,
теперь
I assume they did it under the instruction from
правильное
Washington.
решение. Пусть
If
откажутся.
Washington believes it to be the wrong decision, let it abandon it. Let it find a delicate excuse so that no one is insulted. Let it come up with a way out.
Пусть они от него
It
отказываются.
was not us who made this decision, it was them.
Всё.
So let them go
Они
back on
приняли
it.
неправильное решение.
That is
Теперь мы
it.
должны искать выход из этого неправильного решения.
However, they made the wrong decision, and now we have to look for a way out of the situation to correct their mistakes.
Пусть и исправляют.
They did it, so let them correct it themselves. We support this.
So I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding what you're saying. I don't think that I am. I think you're saying you want a negotiated settlement to what's happening in Ukraine.
Правильно. Но мы
Right.
уже добились этого.
And we
Мы
made it.
создали
We prepared a huge document in Istanbul that was initialed by the head of the
который
Ukrainian
был
delegation.
фотографирован
He affixed his
руководителем
signature to some of the
украинской
provisions, not to all of it.
делегации.
He put his signature, and then he himself said,
Всё, мы-
"We were ready to sign it, and the war would have been over long ago,
Мы были готовы
18 months
подписать,
ago."
и война бы уже давно
However,
закончилась.
Prime Minister Johnson came, talked us out of it, and we missed that chance. Well, you missed it, you made a mistake. Let them get back to that. That is all. Why do we have to bother ourselves and correct somebody else's mistakes? I know one can say it is our mistake. It was us who intensified the situation and decided to put an end to the war that started in 2014 in Donbass, as I have already said, by means of weapons. Let me get back to furthering history. I already told you this. We were just discussing it. Let us go back to 1991, when we were promised that NATO would not expand, to 2008, when the doors to NATO opened to the declaration of state sovereignty of Ukraine, declaring Ukraine a neutral state. Let us go back to the fact that NATO and US military bases started to appear on the territory of Ukraine, creating threats to us. Let us go back to coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. It is pointless though, isn't it? We may go back and forth endlessly, but they stopped negotiations. Is it a mistake? Yes. Correct it. We are ready. What else is needed?
Do you think it's too humiliating at this point for NATO to accept Russian control of what was 2 years ago Ukrainian territory?
Я же сказал.
I said, let them think how to do it with dignity. There are options if there is a will.
Варианты есть. Но если такое желание.
Up until now, there has been the uproar and screaming about inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia on the battlefield.
Стратегического поражения России, поражения на
Now they are apparently coming to realize that it is difficult to achieve, if possible at all. In my opinion, it is impossible by definition. It is never going to happen. It seems to me that now those who are in power in the West have come to realize this as well.
Подумайте теперь.
If so, if the realization has set in, they have to think what to do next.
Что?
We're ready for this dialogue.
Would you be willing to say, congratulations, NATO, you won, and just keep the situation where it is now?
Ну, вы знаете, это предмет переговоров.
You know, it is a subject matter for the negotiations. No one is willing to conduct, or to put it more accurately,
Точнее сказать, хотят.
they're willing but do not know how to do it.
Я не только вижу,
I know they want
я
it.
знаю, что
It is not just I see it, but I know they do want it. But they're struggling to understand how to do it. They have driven the situation to the point where we are at. It is not us who have done that. It is our partners, opponents who have done that. Well, now let them think how to reverse the situation. We're not against it. It would be funny if it were not so sad.
Да, было бы смешно, если бы не было так грустно.
This endless mobilization in Ukraine, the hysteria, the domestic problems, sooner or later it will result in agreement.
Истерика, там, внутренние проблемы.
You know, this probably sounds strange given the current situation,
Все равно мы договоримся. И
but the relations between the two peoples will be rebuilt anyway.
сегодняшней ситуации прозвучит.
Okay, I know that was super, super long, but I mean, he said a lot there, a lot. I mean, he's talking about, again, how he has been willing to come to a negotiation, a peace negotiation, how they had that. And then Boris Johnson came in and, you know, nixed that. And how now, you know, how are they supposed to do that when they're refusing to negotiate with Russia? So again, it's like, it's not Russia that wants this war to keep going on, right? I mean, is that what you got out of this?
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, like, so what are your thoughts on Putin after this interview? Because, you know, we don't see anything in the United States. I mean, again, that's the whole reason Tucker did this interview in the first place. So does anything in this interview that you heard make you question the role of the United States in world politics and like the status of the war in Ukraine?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've been questioning the US role for a long time now, but I think that this definitely confirms my theory that the US is part of this group of global elitists that want one world order and will stop at nothing to get it. And I mean, he flat out said that, like, they want world dominance and they'll stop at nothing. And as Putin pointed out, there's so many mistakes the US has made that have no logical reasoning behind it. So it's either the US is compromised, which I know we've both talked about that before, about Biden being compromised, or now what I'm thinking is that it's much bigger than that. And it's truly this group of global elites really controlling not just the US, but Europe as well. And with everything we've discussed about the UN, the WEF, all of the same nonsensical things happening in Europe that are happening here, like the open borders, the trans agenda in children, DEI, ESG, destroying farmland, and the list goes on and on and on. I can see now, like, this isn't just a conspiracy theory, but it's in fact happening. We are the bullies. And when I say we, I mean like the group of global elites that are controlling our country. And when people don't play our game, we attack with the power of the military industrial complex. And that's exactly what this Ukraine war is all about. And same with Israel, and same with Taiwan if China tries to take that back. And I know we've mentioned this before about how, you know, Putin's been open to peace negotiations, but this whole interview confirms it. It confirms that this is true. And the globalists don't want peace. They want a never-ending war because the war machine lines their pockets, and they want total global dominance. And then here's the last realization I've come to. You know, I've always been an American patriot, like proud of our country, and quite honestly, I've feared China and Russia over the past few years and feared China becoming the big global leader instead of the US. But this interview got me thinking that in working against these BRICS nations, we've actually empowered them. And what has it done for us American citizens? Like nothing positive, not a damn thing. I think that we all need to get back to worrying about America. America first, policies and get the hell out of other world conflicts that are thousands of miles away. And then the one last thing that this made me realize is that my whole entire life, I've always seen Putin as this big nuclear threat. He's going to nuke us. He can't wait to nuke us. And this interview, like, he has no desire to do that. He knows that's game over for everyone, including him. And so I think that these are all just threats that the US uses to keep its citizens afraid so that we don't question things like the Ukraine war.
Yeah, because Putin basically he came out in that interview and straightforward said it. What is this doing for American citizens? Nothing. Why is America focused on the war in Ukraine when we have our own problems, our own border, our own economy and issues to deal with? And I'm very curious to see in the next few days what the spin is going to be on this whole interview, because all these media outlets are going to be talking about it. And here, I want to share like a perspective here in the Czech Republic, because the Czech Republic is like, their perspective is based a lot on the historical influence of communism in the country, and they definitely support Ukraine. And one of the guys, I went on a tour with this guy back in Prague a couple months ago, and we've kept in touch, and I'm editing a book for him, so we talk. And I asked him, like, hey, did you watch this interview with Tucker and Putin? And I said, I'm curious what your perspective is, because he's like, oh, it's all lies. Like, we all think Tucker is a joke here. And I said, well, our media is very censored in America in terms of what comes out of Russia. So I thought it was very interesting. And he was saying, like, the interview was full of lies. The facts were twisted. Putin gave a false history of what happened in World War II. And so I think, like, I'm saying this to point out that, like, how the media is going to portray this interview with Putin is going to depend on the political climate in each country. And obviously the climate here is very much against Russia. The climate in America is very much against Russia. But I have so much respect for Tucker. I don't think he swayed any of the questions. I don't think he was leading in any of the questions. He was straight up asking, and Putin was responding. And I quite honestly have a lot of respect for both of them. I respect what Putin had to say.
I'm really curious to see what's going to happen to Tucker, because they've threatened like not letting him back in the US or like throwing him in jail, which says a lot. It says they are afraid of this interview. And, I think the way that I always look at things is like, I want to hear it directly from the horse's mouth. So like, I would rather watch C-SPAN and see a congressional hearing and see what the actual conversation is than to watch a 20-second clip on Fox News or CNN, or listen to Chuck Schumer tell us what he thinks Putin is going to do. I'd rather hear directly from Putin. And so I think that when people say things like that, it's like, so you'd rather hear from a talking head than hear from the leader of a country. Like, it doesn't make sense, right? But they're totally going to spin it that way. I can already imagine they're going to censor this interview left and right. So if anybody wants to see it, they can go to tuckercarlson.com, and he's got it posted right on the first page. Like you said, Tara, I would probably just skip through the first 30 minutes because it is long and drawn out talking about the history. And when you get to the end is when you get like a lot of the clear questions and answers. And I agree with you. I think Tucker really didn't talk much at all. He asked a few key questions and he let Putin talk the rest of the time. And that's exactly, how it should go. So it's very eye-opening. It's not anything that I necessarily didn't know, but it's like pretty much confirmed all of my theories that the news would say is just a conspiracy theory,
Yep, exactly.
So thanks for tuning in to this special episode. I hope it was eye-opening, and we'll see you back here. Have a great day, and we'll see you back here soon. If you're sick of all the crazy shit going on in our country and you want to express your support and patriotism for the show, head on over to our Etsy store at UO Patriot Chicks and check out our new stickers. The link can also be found on our website. If you love the show and you want exclusive episodes, support the podcast and join the conversation by becoming a member of our Patreon community. We'll be posting weekly member-only podcast episodes and content that isn't available on the weekly podcast. Every Patreon member will also get a free Unapologetically Outspoken sticker and updates about our new sticker release before they're made public. And be sure to follow us on TikTok at Unapologetically Outspoken. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast. The more you support us, the more people we can reach. So help us spread the word.